Hi. In this episode of How We Got Here, let's look at how the US dollar became the world reserve currency. In 1791, Alexander Hamilton helped start the Bank of the United States for the purpose of having a reliable currency which could carry on international trade. British financiers reportedly owned two-thirds of the stock of the Bank of the United States. As the bank grew in power, Thomas Jefferson described it as having become a machine for the corruption of the legislature. So in 1811, James Madison refused to renew the bank's 20-year charter, and almost immediately the British started the War of 1812. And now, after the War of 1812, the bank was reorganized as the Second Bank of the United States and was issued a charter in 1816. By 1822, the Second Bank of the United States was run by Nicholas Biddle, and he boasted of having more personal power than the president. As the federal government's money was deposited in this Second Bank of the United States, Biddle could keep some of it, but with fractional reserve banking, he could lend the rest of it out at interest. And he made money off the federal government money being deposited in his bank. And he bought influence by financing the campaigns of different congressmen and senators. And he owned newspapers and would have them print editorials critical of the opponents. And then ambitious politicians would come to Biddle and more or less trade their allegiance for his support and positive media coverage. And so by the time you get up to the 1830s, similar to Madison, you have President Andrew Jackson. And on July 10th, 1832, Jackson vetoes the renewal of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson wrote, "Some of the powers and privileges possessed by the existing bank are unauthorized by the Constitution, subversive to the rights of the states and dangerous to the liberties of the people. It is easy to conceive that great evils to our country and its institutions might flow from such a concentration of power in the hands of a few men irresponsible to the people. Their power would be great wherever they might choose to exert it, influence elections, to control the affairs of the nation. But if any private citizen or public functionary should interpose to curtail its powers or prevent a renewal of its privileges, it cannot be doubted that he would be made to feel its influences." Jackson concluded, "Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence, it would be more formidable and dangerous than the naval and military power of the enemy." In 1833, Jackson removed all federal money from Biddle's Second Bank of the United States. He stated the bank is thus converted into a vast electioneering machine, which with means to embroil our country in deadly feuds and extend its corruption through all the ramifications of society. The president would feel that he was an accomplice in a conspiracy against that government if he did not take every step within his constitutional and legal power to putting an end to these enormities. Was it expected when the monies of the United States were directed to be placed in the bank that they would be put under the control of one man? This corporation now holds in its hands the happiness and prosperity of the American people. It is high time to sound the alarm. If the despotism be already upon us and our only safety is in the mercy of the despot, how necessary it is to shake it off. One of the most serious objections to the Bank of the United States is the power which it concentrates. Economist Milton Friedman once stated, "Concentrated power is not rendered harmless by the good intentions of those who create it." So you usually have somebody saying, well, let's concentrate power to do something good. Yeah, but it ends up getting passed along and ends up becoming oppressive. On January 30th, 1835, in the midst of this bank war, there was an assassination attempt on Andrew Jackson. The assassin, Richard Lawrence, fired two pistols at him at point blank range, but they misfired, perhaps due to the foggy, humid weather in Washington, D.C. Davy Crockett, who was there with Jackson, tackled the assassin to the ground and took away his arms. The senator from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton, wrote January 30th, 1835, how Jackson's survival irresistibly carried many minds to the belief in a superintending providence manifested in the extraordinary case of two pistols in succession, so well loaded, so coolly handled, which afterwards fired with such readiness, force, and precision, missing fire each in his turn when leveled 8 feet at the president's heart. Jackson was the only president ever to pay off the national debt. He stated in his farewell address, March 4th, 1837, the distress and alarm which pervaded and agitated the whole country when the Bank of the United States waged war upon the people in order to compel them to submit to its demands cannot yet be forgotten. The government would have passed from the hands of the many to the hands of the few. And this organized money power from its secret conclave would have dictated the choice of your highest offices and compelled you to make peace or war as best suited their own wishes. And Jackson goes on, the forms of your government might for a time have remained, but its living spirit would have departed from it. The distress inflicted on the people by the bank are some of the fruit of that system of policy, which is continually striving to enlarge the authority of the federal government beyond the limits fixed by the Constitution. Jackson goes on, the power which moneyed interests can exercise when concentrated under a single head and with our present system of currency was sufficiently demonstrated in the struggle made by the Bank of the United States. So Andrew Jackson ends it, and then during the Civil War, it begins in 1861. Lincoln needs money. And so Lincoln issued a fiat currency called the greenback. And the U.S. went in debt $750 million. But after the war, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains. And that gold was used to help pay off the Civil War debt and to back the greenbacks. President Ulysses S. Grant stated in his inaugural address, 1869, a great war, the Civil War, a great war debt has been contracted in securing to us and our posterity the Union. To protect the national honor, every dollar of the government indebtedness should be paid in gold. It looks as though Providence has bestowed upon us a strong box in the precious metals locked up in the sterile mountains of the far west, and which we are now forging the key to unlock to meet the very contingency that is now upon us. And so then we come to the late 1800s, and you have severe financial panics. People would rush to the bank and they would pull their money out at the same time. That because of fractional reserve banking, the banks would only have a portion of that money actually there. And when they couldn't pay back, the people would get upset and the banks would fail. So President Woodrow Wilson brought back a central bank in 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act, with the promise that this would make sure there would never, ever be another bank run and financial collapse. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. The Federal Reserve failed in its purpose to prevent a financial panic in 1929. The bank run created what's called the Great Depression, and it spread worldwide. When the financial panic hit Germany and Japan, leaders rose up to fix it, but these leaders insisted that they be given emergency powers. Well, these emergency powers turned into them being dictators. Hirohito in Japan and Hitler in Germany. During the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt assumed emergency powers. He issued an executive order in 1933 for the federal government to confiscate all gold held by private citizens to help back the currency. Could you imagine the federal government simply, the president issuing an emergency power, we're going to confiscate everybody's gold. People were hiding gold in those old-fashioned metal coffee cans in their backyards. Henry Ford once stated, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." So the Great Depression, it ends with the starting of World War II, which ended with 70 million deaths worldwide. After World War II, you had 44 countries. They gathered together as part of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which was held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in the year 1948. These countries meet, they sign what's called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And this agreement was that the US dollar would always be backed by gold, and all the other currencies of the world would peg their currency to the US dollar. This made the US dollar the world reserve currency for international exchange. So if you'd want to transfer something, you transfer it from your currency into the dollars, then you transfer from the dollars into whatever the other currency is. Now, the biggest thing that's traded internationally is oil. And Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest oil producers in the world. Now, 2 months before he died, Franklin Roosevelt, February 14th, 1945, met with the king of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz, aboard the USS Quincy on his way back from the Yalta Conference. And so the king of Saudi Arabia agreed to sell his oil in US dollars. And so this created what's called a petrodollar. So everybody in the world's using dollars, and this major oil producer is selling it in dollars. And so all the countries that produce oil are selling it in dollars. 1971, Nixon makes the fateful decision to end the Bretton Woods Agreement by no longer having the US dollar backed by gold. And so instantly, 1971, the US dollar became a fiat currency. The word fiat is Latin for so let it be. In other words, it has a value based on nothing other than the arbitrary decree of the government. And so the US dollar is fiat, but the countries continue to use the dollar because they've been using it and it's sort of handy. And because we had politicians with good financial sense, they've stayed stable. And now having reserve currency as your nation's currency has its benefits. So, for example, if any other country in the world wanted 100 US dollars, they would have to produce goods or services worth $100. If the United States wants $100, all the United States has to do is print it. And so we can create this money, and now the rest of the world uses it. But if we create too much of that money, then it's losing its value worldwide. Economist John Maynard Keynes, he wrote in The Economic Consequences of Peace, originally printed in 1920, he said, Lenin is said to have declared the best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. In other words, make the currency worth less. So until recently, the US had the world reserve currency, and we had financially responsible policies. But lately, the federal government has been debauching the currency. It's been creating trillions and trillions of dollars out of nothing, and astronomically increasing the national debt. Ben Franklin said, when you run in debt, you give to another power over your liberty. As Poor Richard says, rather go to bed supperless than rise in debt. So now the US is the most in-debt nation in the history of the world. The debt is now $23 trillion and increasing by $1 trillion a year. This is very irresponsible. Half of this debt is owned by foreign countries. How do they own it? They buy US Treasury bills. And so they give their money to us. We give them a Treasury bill. And at a certain time, they could come and turn the Treasury bill back into money, and they would get an interest on it. And it was considered the most stable investment in the world, the US Treasury bill. But as the US government is beginning to have problems, these other countries are questioning whether they did the right thing, having so much of the US debt, having purchased it. Now, another interesting thing is Saudi Arabia and other nations, because of the instability of the dollar, they're moving away from using the US dollar in their international exchanges, especially with oil. And so 5 major economies have gotten together: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They call it BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And they sort of did a Bretton Woods II agreement without the United States being a part. And now they're moving to replace the US dollar as the world reserve currency. And this also weakens US foreign policy. For the longest time, the US had done what's called dollar diplomacy. We would give favorable financial terms to friendly nations and punish enemy nations with economic sanctions. For example, during the Ukraine-Russia war, the US pushed Russia out of the SWIFT, which is an international currency exchange system. Well, instead of punishing Russia, it just forced Russia to go to China and decide to sell their oil to China without having to use the US dollar, just straight for the yuan, which is the Chinese currency. And so as the dollar loses its value, you have countries around the world not wanting to hold as many of those dollars as they used to. And so a lot of dollars that have been created are going to be chasing the same amount of goods. And that's just what inflation is. More dollars chasing the same amount of goods causes the price of those goods to go up. It's called inflation. And as the prices rise, your savings evaporates. Your savings will buy less and less. And then it also caused companies to go out of business. And by some estimates, the economy would shrink by 40%. Now, citizens are going to ask the government for help. And the government is preparing to help using the mother of all fiat currencies. It's called a digital dollar, the CBDC, central bank digital currency. It is fiat. It's worth something just because they say it's worth something, but it has some features. It'll be exchangeable with digital currencies around the world. The government will now be able to track everyone's purchases and turn their money off at will. And then they can program this digital currency so it can be spent some places, but it just won't be spent in other places if they deem that other place not pushing their agenda enough. They can even put a time stamp on the digital currency. So if you don't spend it on time, it evaporates. And then they couple it together with something called ESG. So let's say you want to borrow money, they'll do a credit check. Well, if this goes in place, they'll not just do a credit check, they'll do an ESG check. E stands for environmentally friendly, S for socially woke, and G for big government, basically. So ESG, environment, social, and governance. And many states are beginning to push back against CBDC. And so, for example, Florida, Governor DeSantis in March 21st, 2023 said, the Biden administration's efforts to inject a central bank digital currency is about surveillance and control. In Texas, Kevin Freeman of the Economic War Room is working with legislators to push through a transactional currency backed by state-owned gold bullion. So it'll be a digital dollar based on gold. And now the book of Revelation, when you begin to see these digital dollars, this plan for a great reset, which is an economic collapse, Klaus Schwab saying by 2030, you'll own nothing, but you'll be happy. And but if they can track your purchases, it's getting close to what Revelation chapter 13 talks about, where there's a global financial system where you can't buy or sell without a mark. Now, how does one break out of this world system? Now that I've said these depressing things, from a spiritual point of view, the Bible talks about charity. Where does that fit in? Well, charity breaks you out of the world system. It's an act of faith. You need money to live. Why in the world would you give money away? Well, when you do, you're not only helping those in need, you're demonstrating your trust in God to take care of you. And God will bless you when you give. When you get into the habit of giving and you make it through the week and you think, hey, I gave away some money and made tithe and I made it through, then the next week you give away some more money and you make it through. Then pretty soon you're like, you know what? God's going to take care of me. And you end up trusting him. Like in the Bible, Abraham's son Isaac, there was a famine in the land, but he trusted God and he sowed his seed and he got 100-fold return while everybody else was suffering with the famine because he was operating in God's system. And the Lord gave Moses and the Israelites in the desert manna every day. They trusted God. Jesus taught the disciples in Matthew 6, pray to your Heavenly Father, give us this day our daily bread, right? So we're trusting God for our daily bread. He gets us through it today. He's going to get us through tomorrow. We keep trusting him. We keep trusting him. Do you know if you knew the future, you wouldn't need faith, right? And the Hebrews 11 says, without faith, it's impossible to trust God. So we live in a scenario where we do not know the future. We have to trust the Lord. And when we trust the Lord, he comes through for us. So trust in God. I hope this episode in How We Got Here has been enlightening. God bless you.